Thank you so much for having us. First off, I would like to start by thanking Stu and Megan for arranging this brilliant event and a fantastic opportunity for us to come and speak to a big group of people. We're here to discuss the fire which took place on the 14th of June 2017. I live opposite the tower. Yasin al-Wahabi, who died in there with all of his immediate family, was a friend of mine. I witnessed the fire, had cladding in my hair and all over my window. Now, I think that it's really important when we talk about Grenfell to not just focus on the night. I feel that a lot of the time, especially by the mainstream media, we in the community and specifically the bereaved and survivors have often, across this 2.5 years, been encouraged to talk about their trauma rather than to talk about the details and the structures of power which brought such an incident into being. One of the functions of the inquiry has been to muzzle public discourse. You know, I've been in a situation where James O'Brien, of all people, for example, came to the neighborhood on the year anniversary and was transmitting for LBC, a live show. Now, I was one of the people that they asked to speak to, and I said to him before we went on air, you know, this article has just been published by the Daily Mail, actually, and it's identifying a certain relationship between a certain former housing minister and the technical director of one of the companies who seems to be implicated. I'm planning to mention it on air, and I was shut down really in a very, you know, quite rude way actually, and told that there was no way that I was able to talk about this on air. What they would much prefer is me to relay details of the night and the way that it affected me. And I think that this has been, you know, something that across the last 2.5 years has probably been the most frustrating thing. What I wanted to start with really was establishing one core issue. Part of the function of focusing on the trauma and on the local community has been to exceptionalize the fire at Grenfell. It's been to make it something that seemingly only really affects this very small community in one of the richest boroughs in the world. You know, we live in a part of the borough that has a difference in life expectancy to the other side of the borough of 22 years. So yes, it is probably the most unequal space in this country. And there's plenty about the area which is important and should be thought about in regards to Grenfell. However, rather than exceptionalizing it, it should have been generalized. We are in a situation where at least the ACM side of it, which was the cladding, is still on over 200 buildings across the country. In fact, the Times newspaper, they've come out and said 200,000 people across the country are exposed to either ACM or HPL, two dangerous forms of cladding on their buildings. We're talking hotels, we're talking hospitals, we're talking schools, we're talking student accommodations, we're talking cinemas. So surely rather than focusing on the particularities of our community, greater work could have been done to go and look at all of these buildings and talk to the people who are living with the possibility of a Grenfell hanging over their head. But one thing I wanted to ask people in this room, what purpose does cladding serve? Anyone in here have any idea why cladding goes on buildings? In the community, we'd never heard of the word before the 14th of June. It was a completely new word to us. The gentleman here had his hand up. Why is it cladding's a place on buildings?
I think largely to enhance the appearance of it from the outside.
Does anyone else have any other suggestion? So at the moment, it's we have a suggestion from somewhere.
Is it insulation?
That's correct. Insulation. So we've got aesthetics. We've got insulation. Insulation, precisely. So what happened in this country was coming out of the Kyoto agreements to limit carbon emissions. The British government was legally obliged to do so in consideration that 56% of carbon emissions in this country come from the consumption of energy within buildings, the idea had been, and it was something that was also lobbied for by Brofema, which was formerly the name of a group of companies that work on building insulation, on foam insulation. They wanted the opportunity coming out of the Kyoto Agreement to insulate and be subsidized by the government to insulate a lot of buildings around the country. Now, how many of us have heard the term neoliberalism? Can we have a definition for neoliberalism, please? Wow, that many people have heard of it, but it's interesting. It's interesting. It's interesting. Does anyone have a definition?
I'd say it's a new form of liberalism, really.
All good. Anything else? Anyone else have a suggestion? I'd quite like to hear from students what's neoliberalism? Yeah? Deregulation. So deregulation. So the rules that police companies' behavior, that one of the tenets of neoliberalism is the idea that the more rules are in place, the more of an impediment there is to enterprise, to business. You know, neoliberalism in theory differs from neoliberalism in practice, though, because in theory, it's the idea that there's a free market. If these companies compete against each other, then you create better service, and therefore you create a more meritocratic system. In practice, what neoliberalism is the invisible hand of the market wrapped in the iron glove of the state. So what we mean is state subsidies for companies, deregulations for companies. So the idea that a company being prevented by the government from being active will hurt the economy. And so therefore the priority should be easing that process. Now, what I wanted to make a point of saying was, if we understand the crisis of climate change, which actually is linked inextricably to Grenfell, when we look at the fact that this was about lowering carbon emissions within the building, right? So fossil fuel companies get $5 trillion of subsidies globally from all governments globally put together on a yearly basis. The biggest subsidizer of fossil fuel companies is the US government. According to IMF documents, it is $750 billion per year. So that's $5 trillion globally and $750 billion per year by the US government. They're giving subsidies to fossil fuel companies. I don't know how many subsidies are given to agriculture companies, but those are the two main causes of climate change. Fossil fuels and agriculture companies. So to deal with a problem that's caused by this logic of neoliberalism, so the government doing everything it can to support business and making business as easy as possible, the way of dealing with that is by insulating buildings. But then when you're insulating buildings, you see on the other side of it the same logic reproducing itself, in that, as we're going to go through in the talk, regulations are made weaker. The mechanisms by which you protect people's lives are also made weaker, leading to a situation where people's lives are in danger. There are just two more phrases that I want to run by you and see if we can get some type of definition. Okay, the phrase slow violence. What could it mean?
Would it be like when violence is more like structural and cultural, so it's not like someone's hitting you, but it's something that's part of the institutions and the kind of social life, the way you live, that can be effective if you spoke it?
Good. So Rob Nixon was responsible for this phrase, slow violence. And his point was that often we associate the spectacle with violence, as if it's an incident rather than a structure, as if it's a snap action rather than something that happens in a gradual way. And this challenge, he says, of those who are trying to make visible the effects of a signature on a piece of page, on a page in people's lives. So the way that something like regulations or subsidies would then manifest into people's lives is really our challenge today. It's to identify and make visible that invisible slow violence which is taking place. So we'll think about the way that Grenfell could have been the result of a gradual, slow violence, which takes place in a kind of incremental way. Another phrase that I wanted to run by you is necro politics. Akile Mbembe came up with this concept of necro politics. It was political decisions which led to people dying. So these two concepts are going to be quite important in what we're going to talk about. Now, the regeneration, the refurbishment of Grenfell Tower, which led to the building of a school, the academy, on green space underneath the tower. It led to the regeneration of the gym next to it. And the building of that school, in fact, cut off fire brigade access from 3 directions. So it meant, as Grenfell Action Group warned the council, the fire brigade would only be able to access Grenfell Tower from one small corner of the tower. It was part of a much bigger project called the Local Plan. Now, what the Local Plan, RBKC, Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, as we laid out, probably one of, if not the richest borough in the country. It had surplus of £300 million, very different from a lot of the other boroughs in London. But the Local Plan set about to build thousands of new homes. But those homes, it was clear, if we looked at the precedents that had taken place in the area and outside of the area prior to the Local Plan, would not be recreating the existing demographics of the neighborhood. It would be housing in a place where you have Roman Abramovich with a £125 million mansion spitting distance from Grenfell Tower. You've got houses right next to the estate that are worth £15 million. So the idea being that very logic of the stimulation of the market would mean that you would want to replace this area with properties worth a lot more money. It would make sense from almost every part of the equation, apart from the interests of the people who lived in the area. So we understood the refurbishment of Grenfell Tower to be the first step in the demolishing of the rest of our blocks. And by a really cruel twist of fate, we were organising the Save Our Silchester campaign when the refurbishment of Grenfell was finished. And we were saying to each other, and residents of Grenfell Tower, you're the only ones who are safe now, because your tower is not going to be demolished. It's just had this refurbishment. It was worth around £10 million. The rest of our blocks are still under the hammer and due to be demolished. And in fact, it took the Grenfell fire for the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea to back off and say, we are not going to knock down the rest of your blocks now. We're going to back off. But that's for the time being. That's because the community has a level of visibility which would make, frankly, this type of dictatorial policy untenable and impossible. So it's really important to take into account that that process was playing out in front of our eyes. And so what I'm going to show you now is a meeting between Silchester Residents Association member Naheed Ashby confronting the council about the local plan and what it would mean for our area. Bear in mind that this was actually uploaded to the internet about a year before the fire at Grenfell took place. So at this point, our understanding was the regeneration that had taken place at Grenfell protected residents inside Grenfell, but all the rest of us were in danger of, you have differing legal rights depending on your form of tenancy, but we saw ourselves as having to be forced out of the area quite soon. This is a process that has played out across most boroughs in London, the maximisation of profit in relation to land and construction companies basically taking hold of areas. So if you just watch this and listen to what Naheed has to say.
This borough is geographically one of the smallest in London, at just over 4.7 square miles. Yet it is one of the most densely populated areas in Europe. How many more people do you want to bring to this limited space? And how would you propose to provide services for all these people? Things like nurseries, primary schools, doctors. The London Plan Density Matrix suggests 200 to 450 habitable rooms per hectare. You have just finished building 388 habitable rooms on Silchester Garage site that covers 3,336 square meters, which is a mere 0.33 hectare. Even with the higher density of up to 700, this still exceeds the limit. We expect you not to do the same with the rest of Silchester, or we will all be living like sardines in excellently designed routines. Is this how you propose created conservation areas of the future? Surely you must know that this kind of town planning leads to such undesirable outcomes as the omission of loss of urban open space, localized congestion, excessive noise, and the general loss of amenities such as light, sunshine, and the view of the sky, all of which are important to human life and well-being. We are already experiencing the increased congestion and noise produced by the newly occupied West development. Most of Silchester estate is in the shadow of the Westway, which generates high pollution, both in terms of noise and toxic nitrogen oxide. And we are surrounded by extremely busy main roads. We are seriously concerned about the loss of mature trees on the estate, which provide us with protection against the pollution from the Westway. And we are concerned that our open spaces and gardens with their trees, wildlife and bird population are threatened by this regeneration. Demolishing the whole estate would no doubt include destroying the open spaces and trees. This would not only result in environmental disaster, it would result in human tragedy in terms of health, quality of life and life expectancy. Urban causes over 50,000 urban deaths a year. What good is it to have beautifully designed and modern homes to live in if we all get sick and die prematurely? We would like you to consider all of this if when you decide to redevelop our estate. And contrary to how we have been depicted, we are not ghetto people, and our estate is not a ghetto. We have a diverse, thriving community of people with different levels of education, different incomes and different cultures. And our homes may be a little dated, but they are far from being. We ensure perfectly serviceable buildings and thriving communities. The shortage of land in Kensington is nothing new. This has been the case for decades. This land that we call brownfield is where our homes are built on, and should not be treated as surplus land listed saddles to the stable. Please do not look upon this land simply as a building plot without taking into account the human element that is the most important issue here. Finally, in closing, we want the Council to be upfront and transparent, whatever the outcome of this meeting and in general. We may not be wealthy, but we are civilized, intelligent and respectable taxpayers, and it is our democratic and human right to be actively involved in and have a vote on any decision that has an effect on us, our homes and our futures. Thank you for listening.
So at this point, I think it's important to talk about the organizations which existed pre-Grenfell. And then after going through the fire, I'm going to talk about the organizations that exist since Grenfell. So obviously, one of them was Save Our Silchester campaign that was created for this reason. Also, there was Save Our Library, and these campaigns were all about this fight over public space. And the Save Our Library campaign was organizing to stop the local library being leased to a private school next door to it. Rockfielding Mellon, who you saw in there, was deputy leader of the council and head of housing. It just so happened to be a private school which his children were due to attend. He was also himself an aspiring property developer. And we'll get into a little bit more about Rockfielding Mellon a little bit later on. Some of the other organizations are Westway 23, of course, under the Westway motorway, which cuts through the neighborhood, Silchester Estate, Lancaster West Estate, two estates next to each other, and Grenfell Tower being part of it. This motorway is believed to lower the life expectancy of people that live next to it by about 5%. And so as part of the way of compensating the local community, it was promised that the acres underneath the Westway would be used just for community. They would be a public asset rather than a private asset. But of course, we have seen over the decades since the building of the Westway that those spaces have been given to private companies by the council. And so one of the organizations, Westway 23, is based on resisting that process, and they were an organization that were also involved in the Save Our Library campaign. And of course, Grenfell Action Group, an organization set up by Edward Darfan and other colleagues who were aiming to not only put in freedom of information requests, but constantly hold the council accountable for their neglect in dealing with the issues that people had in the building. They set up a blog because they found that this was the best way to expose the way they were being treated. Unfortunately, you know, they have since been credited as being predictors of the fire because in 2016, they put a post, November 2016, saying it will take a great disaster and possibly a fire and a loss of human life to expose the ineptitude and incompetence of the council and the KCTMO, the landlord of the building. And they were vindicated, unfortunately. the most tragic of vindications possible. So these were the organizations that exist in the area. There is an ongoing struggle over public space in the area. And so it's important that we identify these players: Grenfell Action Group, Save Our Silchester Campaign, Save North Kensington Library, and Westway 23. Now, when we look at the fire itself, we have to think of, there's quite a few critical organizations in this, and you know, the building, the refurbishment had about 5 layers of outsourcing to it. So there's quite a lot to unpick, but I would say with the brief time that I have with you, there's 3 organizations that I really want to look at as being integral to it. So the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, their spending on planning had fallen by 81%. They'd cut the housing budget in the area by 76%. They'd cut regulatory services and functions of the council by 22%, and had an overall spending reduction of 36%. So think about all those things and the factors that they might have played in Grenfell, and think about our understanding of slow violence. As I said before, Rockfield Mellon was an aspiring property developer, and he was really responsible for the refurbishment. Initially, they put out a press release saying Leadbitter was the main contractor on it, and it was going to cost about 11.3 million. That was believed to be about 1.6 million pounds over the budget that the council had set aside. And so the project was put out to tender. At this point, the construction company Ryden took it for 8.7 million. Now, following the completion of that process, it had been set aside that there was going to be a zinc-based fire-resistant cladding used on the building. And unfortunately, this was a really critical juncture. Rockfield Mellon and a French company that was helping him with the project managing was a company called Artelia. They set about trying to find an alternative to this zinc fire-resistant cladding, and they came up with a result. And in the email that was titled Urgent Nudge email, the KCTMO, operating under Rockfield Mellon, sent it to this French project managing company, who then went out to look for the company, and they said, we need good costs tomorrow for Rockfield Mellon. What they came up with was the Arconic PE Renabond cladding, which meant that the council saved £293,000, £365. So for about £300,000, they used instead, to save that amount of money, they used instead PE Renabond Arconic cladding, which has 6 millimeters of polyethylene in the middle of it. And it's this 6 millimeters of polyethylene which played a really major role in all of this. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but my understanding is that in EU procurement law, you have to put something out to be bid upon by other companies. But what took place is they went directly to Arconic and really completely skirted that obligation there. Now, that was one role we can look at for RBKC, but it's also indicative of really a wider neglect to people that live in social housing in the borough. When we think about the fact that the New York Times published information about deals that RBKC have made with individual construction companies. So there's national legislation which says if I'm a construction company making a new build and I want to skirt the obligation to have social housing or affordable housing in the new build, all I have to do is pay the local council a certain amount of money, and that obligation is skirted. So I can put properties worth however much I want that will maximize profit. And so, as pointed out by the New York Times, the RBKC, as of September 2016, had taken around £34 million in these forms of payouts from construction companies. Now, when myself and Edward Darfan of Grenfell Action Group confronted the council about this, initially we were told that that money was ring-fenced for the procurement of new social housing. However, what transpired in the meeting made clear that actually it had been spent on maintenance of existing social housing. So do you understand this way in which this could be the difference between somebody staying in an area where their children go to school or where they work? So this kind of violence which happens on paper then has a direct effect on people's lives. Now, the other company that we need to get into, who I mentioned a little bit before, is, of course, Arconic, a US construction company. And really, their use of PE Renabond, the stuff with the 6 millimeters of polyethylene in it, that was on Grenfell, it was discontinued in late June, in 26th of June in 2017. Now, their own brochure that they put out in 2016, more than a year before the fire, had said that this PE Renabond stuff that they put on Grenfell should not go on a building over 10 meters tall. So that's in their own diagram. However, Grenfell is over 60 meters tall. So you have the very company themselves saying this is not safe to go on buildings over 10 meters tall. Now, what Arconic tried to claim, and there is an element of truth to this, as was revealed by the first phase, the report from the first phase, is that the PVC coating of the windows meant that, and it's not clear, as is said in the report of the first phase, whether the fire escaped through a window, the fire that had been started by a Whirlpool fridge that exploded. And Whirlpool themselves told the inquiry that surely the fire had been caused by someone throwing a cigarette out of the window. They denied that the Whirlpool fridge had exploded at all. But the point is that Arconic's argument, so you see all of the companies involved in this process blaming each other. Whirlpool saying it's to do with a cigarette, it's nothing to do with them. Arconic saying that if it wasn't for the PVC coating of the windows, the fire wouldn't have been able to escape from flat 16. Now, what we've also seen, unfortunately, with Arconic is a situation where they are refusing to submit their emails either to Martin Moore-Bick's inquiry or to the police investigation, or to the class action which is being launched in the United States. And so it's a situation now where Interpol have become involved. We'll see to what extent Arconic will submit to the will of either the inquiry or the police investigation. 6 emails were reported on by Reuters, internal emails, of an Arconic sales manager raising her concerns about this cladding being used on a building as big as Grenfell. You have the emails which were sent in 2014 between Deborah French, who is Arconic UK sales manager, and contractors involved in the bidding process. So clearly there was knowledge on the part of Arconic that this type of material was dangerous on that type of building. Now that's pretty scary to think that these companies, but this company specifically Arconic, had knowledge that what was happening was going to endanger human life. And seemingly, when it came a choice between going ahead and making profit, they made the choice to make the profit. Another company that I think is important to look at, which will be dealt with in phase 2 of the inquiry, which hasn't really been dealt with yet in phase 1, is Celotex. Now, according to Detective Superintendent Fiona McCormick, who is has an important role in the criminal investigation, she said that the insulation was in fact more flammable than the cladding. Now, the RS 5000 Celotex stuff, according to Grenfell Action Group, contains within it foam, which is illegal in furniture, but is seemingly not illegal in insulation. Now, there was a few relationships which I think need to be unpicked about regarding Celotex. This is a company that in 2012 had a pink bus driving around the country with the words on it, "Building regulations are changing, go with Celotex." Wonder what they meant by this. In 2011, an employee of Celotex, Rob Warren, wrote a post on their website saying, and the title of the blog was, "Celotex enters government, we are now shaping building regulations to maximize profits to our industry." Now that is a direct quote. I'm not paraphrasing the Celotex post in 2011. Later on, you had the technical director of Celotex, a gentleman by the name of Mark Allen, as an advisor to Sajid Javid, the housing minister, on building regulations. So what were Celotex actually boasting about? If you have a pink bus going around the country saying building regulations have changed, you have a post on the internet saying that, and you have their technical director advising the housing minister on building regulations. What could possibly be going on there? Well, they came out at the beginning of last year and stated that they misdescribed the results of their BRE test for RS 5000 Celotex insulation. The statement being that, and we'll get into BRE a little bit down the line, but the idea being that the building regulations establishment, founded in 1948 and privatized in 1997, now has such a relationship with industry that when you approach this organization to help you test your materials, what they'll do is they'll direct you to a warehouse in Watford, take £15,000 off you, and say, it's your job to then report to us what the results of your test is. So it's actually not really, it's not really an institution that can be relied on to administer these tests. And so what Celotex did their own test, reported their result, and more and more information is due to be coming out. It seems that there's evidence of tampering with tests, seems that there's evidence of BRE even collaborating and helping Celotex in how to get around it in terms of inserting a strip of magnesium at a certain point of the test to avoid the fire spreading to a certain extent. And so what that means is that they came out at the beginning of last year and said they misdescribed the results of their test. Now that's quite extraordinary, that a material that was used in this building is taken off the market and the company is admitting that they said it had met a certain requirement of combustibility that it didn't meet. So it will be interesting to see how that plays out. So I just want to talk about some of the symptoms of neoliberalism and how that relates to this situation and how these organizations became what they have and have done what they seem to have done. So, one of the core tenets is, of course, deregulation. Well, in 1984, the Thatcher government passed something called the Building Regulations Act. Michael Heseltine was in charge of it, and he said it will allow greater industry self-regulation. And so that was the taking of 320 or so pages of building regulations and replacing them with about 24 pages of building regulations. Rather than being prescriptive, those building regulations are performance-based. So for example, it doesn't say, I can't hit Karim, it just says, Karim shouldn't bleed. So what that means in terms of buildings is it's saying, it's not saying you can't use any material, you can use whatever material you want as long as it doesn't burn to this extent. So that's the difference between prescriptive and performance-based. So it being performance-based is saying as long as fire doesn't spread in this way, as long as fire doesn't behave in this way, it can contain whatever you want it to contain. Whereas prescriptive would have said it cannot contain polyethylene, right? Which is really basic, that's elementary. But as Michael Heseltine said and set into action this process, he said it will allow greater industry self-regulation. When industries regulate themselves, we've seen time and time and time again, the collateral damage of that relationship is human life. And this is, why we can safely say that as an economic philosophy, neoliberalism kills people. And in terms of the process as it played out, and I'll never forget that while the refurbishment was happening, Margaret Thatcher actually died. And I remember walking past Grenfell, and the wall outside Grenfell had written on it, R.I.P. Maggie. And someone had crossed out the R.I.P. and wrote F.U. Maggie. And so it's really interesting how that process was set into motion during Thatcher's time. And we literally saw a way in which it manifested in our lives, that weakening of protections for people. And then there was approved document B, which is basically the explanation of how building regulations should be applied. It was rejigged by John Prescott. It's believed that that space that was created in that rejigging gave a lot of creative ambiguity to companies in the way in which they can choose to interpret and apply building regulations. As I've already kind of pointed out, the sort of managed decline of social housing overall definitely plays a part in the way in which people were treated, in the way in which people's complaints were dealt with. You had people that were threatened with legal action, that were threatened with eviction, who died, because of their asking of questions to the council, because of their pushing the council on certain issues. There are people who died in the fire who were threatened with legal action and eviction. So this shows the way in which they deal with people in the area. And of course, we really can't forget the effect of austerity, which is another part of neoliberal policies. It is the transfer of wealth from the public to the private and the transfer of liability from the private to the public. And, for instance, we've had a situation where you've had £100 million cut from the fire services, over 10 fire stations cut, over 29 fire engines lost, and people went into the building with walkie-talkies that were not working, Over 11,000 jobs in the fire service were cut. But, what also needs to be made clear is that the stay put policy was seen to fail at 1:23 a.m. and it was kept in place. That's according to Barbara Lane. It was kept in place and it was only changed to evacuation at 2:37. So at that point, when it changed to evacuation at 2:37, there were 107 people still inside the building and only 36 of them survived. So the way that we see this policy of austerity affecting public service, there's no doubt in my mind whatsoever that it affected the ability of the fire service to respond to such an unprecedented event. And there is one part of the cladding that was purely about aesthetics, and it's the crown on top of the building. And that is what contrasts Grenfell to all of the previous fires that were caused by external cladding. The crown on top of the building, which had the archonic PE Renabond on it, meant that once the fire had spread upwards, it spread to the side and spread around the building. Now, this was something that the Metropolitan Police in the helicopter became aware of before the fire service and did not inform the fire service of. So it's really in this way that we see the cladding as it was on the building caused it to rise up. But then the crown on top of the building, which again is explicitly there just for aesthetic purposes, caused it to go around the side of the building. Had it not gone around the side of the building, then that policy of stay put on at least one side of the building may have meant the people on the other side of the building survived. Because that was part of the understanding, is that if the fire wasn't on your side of the building, there's no way it's going to spread around to the other side. So you should be okay. But unfortunately, that's not what happened. I think it's also important for us to talk about the post-Grenfell organizations that have, and also the incomplete victories that have been achieved, worked really hard for, and been given little acknowledgement really, especially by the mainstream media. Obviously, you have Grenfell United, set up not long after the fire and representing, I'm not sure what the percentage is now, but at least over 80% of bereaved survivors. You know, you have Justice for Grenfell, you have an organization like Grenfell Speaks, which was set up to initially film the scrutiny meetings between the council and local residents, and so really allowed a kind of amplification of that process, which was quite an important part of it at that time. You also have the success of the Save the North Kensington Library, Save Our Library campaign. A memorandum was signed by the local council with members of the community that that library would remain a public asset indefinitely. But of course, that was thanks to the pressure that was put upon the local council by national government, because national government now had pressure brought to bear on them from organizations like Grenfell United. You have the stables secured as a public space underneath the Westway. The stables were due to be turned into something different for private purposes. You also have Wernington College, which we've received guarantee from local government that it will not be turned into flats and people will still be able to pursue higher education there. So there have been victories. You also have a situation where the change in regulation and the banning of, seemingly by the Tory party, of combustible materials. But however, that has been problematized by Adrian Dobson, in a statement on behalf of the Royal Institute of British Architects. The regulation change was to say that only materials which meet the requirement of A2 and A1 could be used. Now, he said that the Royal Institute for British Architects strongly recommends that the government supports a comprehensive ban on combustible materials on all high-rise buildings, continuing to allow materials of limited combustibility, which is what A2 classification is unacceptable in the wake of a tragedy at Grenfell Tower, and the evidence from the UK and around the world that these materials do not provide adequate protection for the public. You know, the point is that that level of limited combustibility, there were things like the cladding that these companies were able to depict as meeting the A2 limited combustibility level that was necessary. However, as Adrian Dobson makes the point here, is that A2 is not far enough. We need everything to be A1. He goes on to say, it's good news that the government has acted on the Royal Institute of British Architects' recommendations to ban combustible cladding on high-rise residential buildings over 18 metres. The ban needs to be accompanied by clear guidance and effective enforcement to promote fire safety and leave no room for cutting corners. However, toxic smoke inhalation from the burning cladding very likely contributed to the disproportionately high loss of life at the Grenfell Tower disaster. Permitting all products classified as A2 does not place any limits on toxic smoke production and flaming particles, droplets. In our view, this is not an adequate response to the tragic loss of life and might still put the public and the fire and rescue authorities at unnecessary risk. So, just to wrap up my part of this, I just want to say some of the things that have come up, some of the useful things and maybe less useful things that have come up from the phase one, the report on phase one of the inquiry. So importantly, the gentleman who lived in flat 16, who has had a terrible time since his fridge exploded, his Whirlpool fridge exploded. This is somebody who the mainstream media put out there as completely without any basis in truth, accused him of packing a suitcase and leaving and not caring about the rest of the people in the building. He was actually exonerated by Morbick's report. He said clearly that he did everything that could have been required of him. He switched off all of the electricity in his flat. He knocked on all of his neighbors' doors on his floor and he left, you know. But this is somebody that, because of the mainstream depiction of the events of the night, has had to have a security detail, has had to have protection of his life since the fire on that night. There's of course a wider point about the media, which I'm gonna mention in a second, which I'd like to just talk about a little bit. Also, one important thing that was established that is both a blessing and a curse by the first phase of the inquiry was that the cladding on the building was non-compliant. So what he said, and he's specified Arconic, despite the fact that Arconic wrote to him saying, please don't make these conclusions, don't make conclusions such as this at this stage. He said that the PE Renabond polyethylene cord Arconic cladding was non-compliant with building regulations. So that is advantageous to the campaign in that it opens up the space for accountability and it opens up space for really challenging the company legally. Now we can say, with the backing of institutional support really from Morbick, that this company and the cladding on the building was illegal. The way in which that is difficult, and there's one word that Morbick does not mention throughout the phase one report, is the word deregulation. He avoids it like the plague. Now, he may have seen it as maybe too ideological, because the idea then is, if you're going to talk about deregulation, it has all types of other implications for other aspects of the construction industry. But the point is that by saying that it was non-compliant, it gives the government the space to say, well, there's nothing wrong with our existing building regulations, which actually is the opposite of the situation. Yeah, and that's I mean, Robert Black of the KCTMO is described as ineffective and easily distracted and easily detached from his task. You know, the fire brigade were not able to get access to the plan of the building until almost 7 a.m. that day. He took over half an hour after he received it, he took about half an hour to send it. So, you know, the ineptitude of the landlords has been partly revealed as well by the report on phase one. But the point I wanted to make about the media was that not only have they led us to a situation where the gentleman that was had his life changed forever from flat 16 was forced into this corner by the coverage of the mainstream media. You also had a few other factors. So on the night of the fire, there's a family in which 3 generations from the grandmother to the grandchildren, granddaughters died. Now, we saw them on the 21st floor, waving out of their window, trying to communicate to them. Now, this was at about I estimate about 2 a.m., between 2 a.m. and 2:15. And the fire was getting closer and closer to them. We saw it move sideways towards them. They were on the other side of the building from where the fire started. And what we saw at that time was a helicopter in the sky. Now, a lot of the people that were inside the building were communicating with people outside and saying, you know, the helicopter's out there, surely they're going to help us. There's so many helicopters in the sky. Now, we're at that time, because things are so apocalyptic and because everything is complete chaos, you're hoping for some type of divine intervention. You're hoping for something that may not have been logistically possible. You're thinking, surely this helicopter keeps circling around this family because they're going to help them, right? That's what you might think. We see the helicopter move towards the family, and about 100 meters from the window, it turns round. Now, the next day, I went to the front page of the Evening Standard, and I saw on the front page of it a picture of that family in their dying moments taken from a horizontal angle, meaning that the only person that could have taken that picture of that family in their dying moments was in that helicopter. Okay, we look at the fact that a gentleman threw himself out of the 15th floor in an attempt maybe to survive the fire, and he died. His body was taken, I'm not sure by who, but was put in one of the blocks in the walkways next to the fire, literally outside someone's front door. This is the day after the fire. This gentleman, Omega, was coming home, and he found this body outside his front door. It's a dead body outside his front door. He filmed it and put it on the internet saying, if this is your relative, you just have to know this is what's happening. Okay, I mean, perhaps an unusual thing to do, perhaps. But in that type of situation, we did not know, it felt like the sky was falling down, to be completely honest with you. Now, he was contacted by someone from the media who said, I'd really like to meet up with you and talk to you about this footage that you've just put online. And when he went to meet that journalist, he was met by a police officer, arrested, and served 3 months in prison. He was set up by the person that contacted him from the media. The Daily Telegraph violated the embargo in a way that had been placed on the Phase 1 report. And, you know, the bereaved and the survivors had signed non-disclosure contracts really for it to say that they wouldn't speak about the contents of it. So they had time to absorb this massive document. You know, there's a lot to get through. And the Daily Telegraph, what I believe, in an attempt to define the narrative on the back of the report, immediately put out the news that there was this, to create this antagonism, I feel, between people in the community, between bereaved and survivors, and between the fire service, rather than doing what was in public interest at that point. Morbic said, ACM, and specifically archonic PE Renaissance stuff on buildings, is a danger to life and it's non-compliant. If you're the media, that's the point that you should have run with, because you should have said it's now in the public interest for us to go to all of these buildings that have it. And by the way, and this is again speaks to the point of Grenfell between being exceptionalized and being generalized, of the just over 200 buildings that still have this form of cladding on it, about 170 of them are buildings in which people are private leaseholders, private buildings. And it's actually the private sector that has been the hardest to get this stuff removed off, because in the public sector, it's clear where the buck stops. Whereas in the private sector, you have all types of obfuscation and dissolving of responsibility, which is possible. You have people that, you know, own their properties being told they have to either pay £30,000 or £40,000 like Capital Key in Greenwich to get this stuff removed off of their buildings, and that the value of their property has gone to zero. So the majority of the buildings that this stuff is still on are in buildings where people own the properties. Why would you not, as the mainstream media, take that opportunity to go to every single one of these buildings across the country, interview the people inside these buildings, because those people are really suffering at the moment, really, really suffering. There are fantastic organizations like Inside Housing, like Rags Martel from ITV, who have done a great job at speaking to these people, acknowledging their existence even. But why are these massive media companies not doing that job? I think one of the lessons that needs to come from Grenfell is in whose interest is the media acting in a lot of the time. That has to be critically interrogated. You know, you look at the ease with which the words Grenfell fraudster have been put together. It's a complete oxymoron. If somebody is defrauding on the basis of relation to Grenfell, they have nothing to do with the tower. But yet those words have been thrown together so easily to create this impression around the country that Grenfell is only to do with undeserving others, undeserving Muslims, fraudsters, subletting, all this mantra that's been created. You know, one of the things that Theresa May did, which was really damaging, talking about an amnesty for people that are here illegally. No one's taken her up on this ridiculous amnesty, but what it did is it created the basis by which the rest of the population could look at these people in this area as having nothing to do with them. In order for us to build a campaign which is actually successful, you need people around the country to see themselves in the community and to understand that it could very easily have been any other community in this country, and it still may be. And in fact, if anyone in this country, even people that want to burn effigies of Grenfell Tower, can ever be safe in their homes, again, it will be thanks to people like Karim and thanks to the bereaved and the survivors who have already lost so much and who are no longer fighting for the people they lost or fighting for themselves. They're fighting for the safety of everyone around the country. Thank you very much.
Don't really know how to follow that, really. Thank you so much to Lowkey. Thank you so much, guys, for having us. I'm going to talk to you more about sort of my personal experience and how I came to be in the position that I'm in today. I think it's important that I mention before the 14th of June 2017, I'd never been an activist or a campaigner or a public speaker or anything like that. I played football when I was younger and worked in the motor trade for 15 years of my life. I have a family man, enjoyed fishing, so all of this was new to me. But in the past 2.5 years, my world and my life had completely changed. As some of you may know, I lost my uncle in the Grenfell Tower fire. He was 57 years old at the time. He lived on the top floor. He was a disabled man. He had trouble walking. What he was doing on the top floor of that tower, I don't know, but I guess that's a question to be asked later down the line. And he loved being in his flat. He loved being at the top floor of the flat. He was a very religious man and said that it made him feel closer to God. And right where the Westway was from his flat, he could see the football pitches where I would spend most of my time, my free time anyway. And he would always text me making fun of how rubbish I was when I was playing football. So the banter was just incredible. You know, he taught me how to tie my tie. He taught me values of work. Unfortunately, I grew up without a father, and he, on many of occasions, took that role as my dad. My grandmother, his mum, lives just underneath the tower in the Lancaster West Estate. She witnessed everything. And that's where we all grew up. We all lived there together. We was all born and raised there. That's sort of the hub of the family and still maintains that to this day. I wasn't there on the night of the fire. I arrived there on the early hours of the morning. And when I got there at about 7:30 in the morning, the tower was still in flames. There was flames coming out of my uncle's flat, smoke coming out, firefighters everywhere, media everywhere. And I remember just looking up at the tower once and just thinking, wow, oh my God, like this is so unreal. It was like being in a movie scene. And I remember consciously making the decision to not look up at the tower again until I found my uncle. And the weeks to follow was basically me and my family putting up posters in the community, trying to get any sort of information about where my uncle was and had anybody seen him, communicating with the survivors in various community centers in the area where they'd all taken refuge, trying to see if anyone had seen him. And it was at that moment, I think it was in the first day, at the Rugby Portobello Club, which was one of the community centres there, where Ed Dafan was and many of the other survivors, is where Grenfell United formed. You know, still in their pyjamas, in the clothes that they were wearing when they escaped the fire, when they escaped the tower, organising themselves, writing up on large pieces of papers, you know, who was accountable in the room and how they were going to go about getting important documents in terms of driver's license and passports, and, you know, just trying to really put their arms around each other and formed a humanitarian group, because very quickly they realized no one was going to come to help us. Nobody from the local authority, nobody from the council, nobody from the government. They were left alone. But I quickly left that space because I realized that I needed to find my uncle. I needed to find out where he was and made sure that he was okay. My grandmother is in her 80s, and my great uncle is also in his 80s, and there isn't anybody else really to take that responsibility to try to find out what had happened and what was going on. I have younger siblings, and their ways of dealing with it after seeing such shocking, or witnessing something so shocking, they sort of had to, I guess, run away. And that was quite tough. So the weeks to follow, it was just really me running around, putting up posters in the community, trying to find out any bit of information about what my uncle was. I was then contacted by the media. The media were everywhere, and I was contacted by Sky News, and they said, look, we want to help you find your uncle if you let us sort of come with you and film you while you're doing what you're doing, and hopefully somebody may see this and somebody will get in touch with you and try to give you any bit of information. So I didn't know what else to do, so I took them up on that offer. And it was only, I think, a couple of days after Sky News were with me, somebody had sent me a video of my uncle's neighbor, who was this woman with her 2 young children, and she had made a Facebook Live video of the smoke coming into her flat, of the smoke in the landing, and she had opened her door, and people, or she was inviting people into her flat for refuge. And one of them seemed to have looked like my uncle. He was wearing the same sort of clothes he was wearing. We heard his name being shouted in the background. Sky News enhanced the visuals for us, and we were very, very certain that my uncle had walked into this lady's flat. A day after that, again, through what we was doing with Sky News, we was then contacted by somebody else who shared us another video that this lady had made, which was a Snapchat video, which you couldn't see anybody in, but you could see flames coming into the flat, and you can hear this young girl sort of almost in tears saying that she wanted her daddy and she was scared. And you could hear this man's voice saying to her, don't be scared, everything's going to be all right. And Sky News again enhanced that audio for us, and we heard it maybe over 1,000 times, and were certain that that was my uncle. He was a very calm man. You wouldn't be able to tell how he was feeling through his facial expressions, and he was a very religious man, and he probably would have accepted his fate very early on. He made 5 phone calls to the fire services that night, and on every single phone call he was very calm, collected, polite, explaining to them where he was and what he was experiencing, and saying that he couldn't leave the flat because of his disability, he couldn't go down the stairs. And on every occasion he was promised that somebody was coming to get him. They knew where he was, to sort of wrap him around his head a wet towel, and to wait for somebody to get him. And he was always very polite. Thank you very much, I really appreciate it, thank you. 5 phone calls. Sadly, nobody did come. So to a certain degree, that gave me a little bit of comfort, knowing that in my uncle's last moments, he was comforting a young child. You know, in my eyes, you know, he was a hero. And you can imagine the terror that people must have been feeling, being stuck on the top floor. A lot of people couldn't make it down the tower and actually went to the top thinking that they were going to be rescued, like Lowkey was mentioning earlier, by helicopters. But that also wasn't the case. My uncle was then, it took for him to be identified about a month and a half, and technically until that moment he was technically missing. And the police weren't giving us any information. We weren't receiving any information from the council. We were left alone to try to find out things for ourselves. And it was only until the 30th of July that he was then identified, and we had to wait to hear from the coroner when we could have him back so that we could lay him to rest. Unfortunately, that process as well took about a month. But I remember getting the phone call from the coroner and her saying, you know, come, I want to talk to you about your uncle and explain to you where we found him and how we found him. And obviously, you know, that was really, really scary for me. I went there with my wife and with my auntie, and, you know, they were all quite upset and emotional, understandably. But I remember I had to remain quite solid in my emotions, you know, while they were crumbling and crying and you know, witnessing and experiencing the most horrific moments of their life. I had to remain very strong, even though I was feeling exactly the same as them, because I had to be that rock for my family. And I remember meeting the coroner, and her name is Dr. Fiona Wilcox. She's an absolutely amazing human being. The support that she has given to so many of us has just been so valuable, really. And I remember her looking at me in the face and saying to me, we found your uncle in his flat, and you can pretty much have him straight away. And we found him complete. Now that's, for me, was something quite special in such a terrible situation, because a lot of my friends that lost their families did not have that, I don't know what the word is really for it, but they didn't get their families back complete the way we did with my uncle. I apologize if some of what I'm saying is distressing, but I think it's important you understand these details. I think it's important that you understand the horror that we had to go through, and we still remember every single day, but yet we get our dead families insulted on national radio by our government because apparently they lack common sense. But I won't talk about that so much right now. But there were also some other complications in actually burying my uncle, giving him the burial he deserved. There were families that were claiming, or people that were claiming to be his family, and claiming that we were his fake family, stopped the process of us taking my uncle and laying him to rest because they were trying to benefit from, I don't know, money, I guess. That's the only reason why a lot of these people have tried to manipulate the vulnerable in the system. And like Lowkey was mentioning earlier, these fraudsters that had nothing to do with our community or Grenfell and benefited from the loss of lives just so that they can gain some money. So it took us a month to legally challenge these people who we don't know who, to this day, who they are. And the coroner was like, look, you know, I have to respond to them legally because they've responded to me. They've contacted me via solicitors saying that, you know, they were his family, and they were asked on a number of occasions to prove it, and they never did. And in the end, the coroner got fed up and says, look, this man needs to be laid to rest, so please come and take him. But what that meant is that we had 24 hours, or we took my uncle and laid him to rest within 24 hours because we were scared the moment we were going to arrive to collect him, another group of people was going to do the same thing. So that meant that we laid him to rest very quickly. He didn't get the burial we felt he deserved, and a lot of his friends did not attend because of the short notice of the burial that we put out. And that was quite horrific, really, for us. But at least we got to lay him to rest, and that was on the 18th of September. So the fire had happened on the 14th of June, and my uncle was finally buried on the 18th of September. So it was just, you know, absolute hell for me and my family. And it was only after my uncle was buried did I then start really getting involved with everything else that was happening and catching up with the rest of the survivors that were organizing themselves and forming Grenfell United at the time. And I remember as well at that time, it was when we had the I can never say this word, apologies, preliminary hearing for the public inquiry that Theresa May had ordered. And I remember being there with my solicitors, and Sir Martin Morbick came out, gave this whole big spiel, and how he was appointed as well did not go down very well. A lot of us didn't feel like he was the right person for the role. He was pulled out of retirement. His background was in shipping. He doesn't really understand the community and the diversity of the community, but we didn't really have a choice. So I remember being there. He gave this big speech, and right at the end, a solicitor or a barrister representing some of the families stood up and wanted to make a request on the behalf of the survivors and the bereaved. And as he was speaking, Sir Martin Morbick looked at him in the face, turned around, ignored him, and walked away. And I remember that was like a really sort of like pivotal moment for me, because it made me feel so frustrated that, is this how this whole inquiry and the investigation is going to be like? They're just going to run with whatever they want to run with, ignore the survivors and the bereaved and all of the families that are at the heart of all of this, and just do what they want to do. And I felt so strongly about this that I then decided to get some advice from my solicitors and said, look, I don't feel like this guy is the right guy to be leading such a big inquiry. I don't think he is the right person to do so, or at least not do it by himself. I know that in previous inquiries, there were people, there were panel members that sat alongside the judge that had the same authority and power as the judge, that were appointed in the public inquiry by the Prime Minister. So me and my family decided to write to the Prime Minister and urge her to listen to our request for adding additional panel members in this public inquiry, because we did not feel like this one person, it was right for just one person to be looking after something so big. And then also through doing that, I had made some social media videos explaining to some of the other families what panel members were, because there were a lot of confusion about panel members and assessors. And you have assessors that are experts that give advice to the judge, and you have panel members that sit alongside him that have the same decision-making powers. So I remember I made this video, which went out to all of the community and the survivors and bereaved, and through so I had been in contact with 2 other bereaved family members that lost relatives in the fire, and they had come up with an idea with, we should start a petition. We should start a government petition, and if we do this, we can make it public, we can get people to support us, get signatures to have it then debated in Parliament, which would then mean that they would have to give us what we want. So that's what we did. We teamed up together and we put out this petition. And I remember we did a lot of media. This was my first ever experience in doing any campaigning or anything like that. But I just felt so strongly about it. And obviously learning that a lot of others did as well. And I remember we launched a petition in November 2017. We had reached about 26,000 signatures. We needed 100,000 to have it debated in Parliament. And I remember just before the Christmas break, maybe a couple of days before, Theresa May came out and says, no, I won't be giving you this panel. And it was done so strategically, because the timing of it meant that our solicitors could not appeal her decision. Because by the time that they could, the Christmas break and the New Year's break would sort of go outside of that time frame. I remember being so angry, thinking like, not only are we not able to rebuild our lives that have changed forever, they are making us now campaign and knock on their doors just to get our voices heard, to ask for something that's really quite fair, we believe, that has been put in place for other inquiries, not inquiries that weren't anywhere near as big as a catastrophic event like this. And yet, just before Christmas, they tell us no. And all that did really was just urge us on to really get her to change her mind. And that's really when I started, Grenfell United supported the petition, and that's really when I started working with Grenfell United on on a sort of on an everyday basis, really. I think it's important to mention as well, guys, that Grenfell United is an organisation that's formed just by the survivors and the bereaved. We are all volunteers. We don't get paid. We are not a charity, so we don't handle money. I think we have like £11 in Grenfell United's account, which we use to buy pens and papers and stuff like that. There is a foundation that has been set up. It's called the Grenfell Foundation. And that's where any money donated goes to. And it's not just for Grenfell United, it's for the community. We use the foundation to do our yearly anniversary events or any campaigns that we do. And we also use it to help any other project in the community as well. But Grenfell United is not a charity. We're just an organization, a pressure. We call ourselves like a pressure organization where we campaign for justice and we campaign for change and put pressure on the necessary organizations and the government to make sure that the spotlight remains on them until some action is taken and people are safe in their homes and our families aren't being remembered for the way that they are today. So it wasn't really until Stormzy at the Brit Awards made the comments he made about Theresa May. We didn't know about this, by the way, and neither did the Brit Awards. He submitted to them a rap that he was going to do, and on the night he performed something completely different. He then texted one of the community campaigners who had sort of said to him when he'd come to the area and met and said, look, if you really want to do something, you have a platform, use it and do it. Don't come here and say thoughts and prayers with you guys and put your arms around us. You have a platform. If you really feel strongly about doing something for us, then use your platform and do it. And I don't remember the exact words of the text message that Stormzy sent, but he said something along the lines of, that was for you guys. I hope now that shines some light on the madness that's going on or whatever. And after that performance he did, he then took to social media. He'd heard about our petition. He took to social media and urged his followers to sign this petition. And within, I think, 24 hours, we'd gone from 26,000 signatures to 155,000 signatures. So that for us was absolutely amazing. But also look at the lengths that we had to go to just to get the government's attention to listen to us and give us something really that should have been put in place from the beginning. But Stormzy has been, supporting us quietly for a while, which is good. But it's also quite sad that you have to go to these great lengths just to get your voices heard. And as we know now, Theresa May has agreed to give us this panel. The panel members have been appointed. We are yet to meet them, but they will be part of phase 2 of the inquiry, which is due to start in January next year. And we're all quite eager for that to start, but it's probably likely to be delayed. I don't think the public inquiry phase 2 will start in January next year because they are still waiting on documents from, like Lowkey was saying, Arconic. To this day, Arconic is the only organisation involved with Grenfell that has not submitted any evidence to them, the police, or the lawsuits that are happening in the States. I mean, that speaks volumes. You know, I don't need to talk about the technical aspects of their products. I think Lowkey explained that really, really well, but that speaks volumes. But also, reading up about Arconic, this isn't the first time their products have got them into trouble, and this isn't the first time that they've behaved this way. You know, they are, I believe, a $14 billion company, and up until now, they've been spending £18 million every quarter just on legal fees for Grenfell. Now, what does that tell you? You know, they are doing everything and anything they can to protect their name and protect their reputation. They don't want you to know their name. They don't want you to know who they are. But I urge you to remember that name, Arconic, Arconic, Arconic. But they're not the only ones. There are many others as well. And I'm going to tell you about something that I believe has happened to me for speaking out about them. I might actually just start talking to you about that now. I might ask you to help me as well because you do it so well. One of my main roles as Grenfell is I'm one of the spokespeople, so I do a lot of media whenever something happens. So we try not to talk too much publicly as Grenfell United unless it's important or we need to do so. And I'm one of the ones who goes out on the media and on radio and stuff like that and speaks about the issues that are happening at the time. Now, remember I was saying to you, I worked in the motor trade. I worked for Audi, and I've been with Audi for 5 years. I was the sales operations manager for Audi City London, which was their digital flagship showroom in Mayfair. I was really happy with my role. I had started as a trainee sales exec and worked my way up within 4 years to that position, which was unheard of in the motor trade. And I took it as a dream job. But after Grenfell, my priorities changed. I was made redundant from my job in May 2018. It was literally the day of my birthday, May 23rd, a day after I had given a tribute to my uncle at the public inquiry, where they tried to stop me from saying the things that I was saying about these companies. I then was told that they were closing the showroom down and there weren't other jobs that they were going to offer me. Now, yes, I worked for Audi, but Audi, it was one of these franchise companies that had the license to sell Audi's products. So I didn't directly work for Audi, I sold Audis, or I worked in the Audi showroom, but the company I worked for was called Sytner. Now, this company is an American-owned company by a guy called Roger Penske. They're called in the States Penske Automobilia. They are the largest prestige retailer of cars in the UK and US. And I later learned that Arconic has an affiliation not only with Audi, but also with Penske. Now, I don't know if you guys know this, Arconic are not only a construction company, but they also make parts for aeroplanes. They make parts for the F-35 fighter jet. They make parts for the 737 Boeing. I don't know if you guys have heard the news about the planes that crashed recently because of faulty parts. Yeah, these parts were made by Arconic. Arconic also make parts for automobilia industry. So they make metal components for Audi, they make metal components for Mercedes, they make metal components for Dodge, for Fiat, for Alfa Romeo. They have their hands in everything. I was asked to come on a TV or a news show with Victoria Derbyshire in December 2018, I believe. And I remember saying to her along the lines of something like, we now know that Arconic and Celotex contributed to making that building a death trap, which contributed to the loss of lives of our family, I believe, if that was right? I remember about 30 seconds after saying that, Arconic had tweeted Victoria Derbyshire and saying that we are working with the public inquiry, sorry for your loss, you know, blah, 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 just usual sort of nonsense that they would say. And this was a few months after I was made redundant. Now, after I was made redundant, I had not been looking for work. I was happy to spend time with my family. I was happy to work with Grenfell United because that's really where my focus was. And it wasn't only until after that that I started looking for work. Now, when I was at Audi, I was getting job offers almost every week. I was getting job offers to go work in Dubai, in Abu Dhabi, in Italy, but I didn't want to do so. I was happy where I was. To the point where when I started applying for work, and after that moment of going on TV and saying what I said, I stopped getting email responses back from the agencies that I was working with. I stopped getting phone calls back. I was communicating with a couple of sales directors for various different car companies, one of which was Ferrari, and they stopped talking back to me. They stopped communicating with me again. Eventually, I was able to find a job at Mercedes, where I was employed as a sales executive. And 3.5 days into my job, I was called by my sales manager and told, Karim, I want you to turn your computer off, disengage with any customers, and wait for me to come and speak to you. I remember saying to him, well, I can't just sit here all day and do nothing. What's this about? I was then told that something had flagged up about me in their head office in Germany, and they could no longer continue my employment. I was like, what? What's going on? What have I done? And I started thinking, have I done something? Did I crash someone's car? Did I don't know. Legally, they don't have to disclose the information because the time that I was at the company was only 3.5 days, right? So there's no legal obligation to them to have to tell me the reasons of them letting me go. I know that because I've done that. I've let people go in the past before. And he just basically told me, hand in your car keys and leave the premises. half an hour later, I was waiting for my wife in PC World in Brentford for her to come and pick me up. I said to her, honey, I just got fired. I don't know why. I have no idea why. They wouldn't tell me why. But yeah, can you come pick me up and take me home? I spoke to my solicitors and they believed, or they said to me that, Karim, we think you've been labeled a troublemaker within the industry. You know, you're going on TV and calling out the government and calling out these industries, these companies. And the last thing these car manufacturers want is somebody going on TV calling out the government when they're trying to negotiate deals to sort of keep business going with them and the government after Brexit. I was like, this is nonsense. You know, this is some Jason Bourne type of stuff. Like, what do you mean I'm a troublemaker? And, you know, and it was only until I started speaking with Lowkey and he spoke to me about blacklisting. And spoke to me about a guy called Dave Smith who wrote a book about blacklisting and exposing the blacklisting that was happening in the construction industry. And I met with this guy, we met with him together and spoke to him, and he basically uncovered the blacklisting of 3,200 people, I believe, in the construction industry, where people were complaining about, for example, toilets not working properly on the building site and being blacklisted from being able to work with certain construction companies. And he said to me, you'd gone on TV and called them out and basically said that they were involved in killing your families. What do you think has happened to you? So I kind of see it as a blessing in disguise, because like I never wanted to return to the motor industry anyway. I hated it, and I do urge you guys, don't ever work in the motor trade. I know it can seem glamorous, and I know it's like they give you nice cars and you know you have the opportunity to earn loads of money, but they take your life away. I promise you they really, really do. I was working 6-7 days a week, 10-12 hours a day. Yeah, I had a nice suit on and I had a great car and I was earning great money, but I wasn't happy. You know, it was the status that I thought that you should have in this society. You know, wear nice clothes, have a nice watch, drive nice cars, earn good money. You'd made it, right? But that wasn't the case. You know, I hardly got to spend time with my family. I hardly got to do the things that I was passionate about, like football and fishing and eating and music. So I don't really have any hard evidence to prove that this has happened to me, and it would be very difficult to prove that it's happened to you. But when you look at the history in terms of the construction industry and the blacklisting, when you look at what these companies do and the levels they go to try to silence people, or to try to get you in such a state where they stop you from feeding your family, stop you from being able to keep your sanity to the point where you break down and become a crazy person and institutionalize or whatever. And it's done the complete opposite to me. It's almost made me be like, wow, okay, is that what you guys are going to just trying to get me to be quiet? Well, it's gonna be quite counterproductive for you, because all you're going to do now is make me raise my voice. You know, we're on a road right now that we can't predict, and they tell us tone it down, but we can't resist. And that's something that my son actually said to me not too long ago. He said, Dad, you should use that in one of your speeches. And I thought that was quite good. My son's 11 years old, by the way. So yeah, but we're still learning new things. I've seen the evidence that's going to be coming out in the phase 2 of the inquiry. I can't talk to you guys about that, but what I can say is none of it has shocked me. Nothing that I've learned up until now about how these people were behaving and treating normal people has shocked me. But what has shocked me is, through what I've seen, is the blatancy of it. These people, these organizations weren't even trying to hide what they were doing. They weren't even trying to hide. They just thought that they were never going to get caught and nothing bad was ever going to happen to them. You know, and Grenfell should really be for all of us, for the country, where this stops. Because Grenfell isn't the first time where loss of life has happened because of corporate negligence or people being neglected when they should be looked after. This has been happening for decades, and it's been happening all over the world. And we have these investigations and we have these inquiries and we have these findings, and People, you know, we get charged, but nothing ever happens. No one ever goes to jail, and ultimately the people that pay the price are us, the everyday people, the taxpayers, the people that have suffered the most. And that's what I'm scared is going to happen here with Grenfell. But I believe that through what we have learned and what we have found out and what we are going to learn is going to be so blatant. And I also strongly believe that if we get the rest of the country to recognize, and like Lowkey said, see themselves in our community, this isn't just an issue that's happened in a small part of London. There are hundreds of towers in this country that have the same cladding. There are hundreds of buildings, thousands of buildings that have the same cladding that was on Grenfell Tower. Student accommodations, as we've seen quite recently in Bolton. There have been 6 fires now this year in this country. And we keep saying to the government, you are not doing enough. We have warned you and we keep warning you. And if someone dies, the blood is on your hands. And the government isn't acting quick enough. And they are also to blame. It's not just these companies that spend ridiculous amounts of money to try to cover themselves and work their way in building regulations and stuff like that. It's also the government that have allowed themselves to be infiltrated by these massive corporate bodies. The government are not serving us, they're serving themselves and they're serving their pocket. And we need to uncover this. And we can only do it if people like yourselves join us and help us amplify our voice. Because at the moment, it's just a small community trying to change things across this country. And yes, we've had some small wins, but it's becoming increasingly difficult to keep our voices being heard. And if the rest of the country stands with us, they will have to listen. The last thing they want is social unrest. And we are not far from that. We are really, really not far from that. We have had to contain our community on so many occasions because a lot of young people are angry and they need to project that anger. And obviously, we don't condone violence and stuff like that, but it's getting to a point where we can only do enough to stop that from happening because not enough is being done. 2.5 years on, these fires are still happening. We're still campaigning to get our voices heard, to get them to take this cladding down, to get them to change building regulations. For God's sake, just because people live in social housing does not mean that they should be quiet if they have a complaint or a concern about where they live. You know, they're being treated as if, well, you're quite lucky to have this place, so you should shut up or we're going to send you somewhere else. We need to change that. That's not what we pay our taxes for, and that's not a definition of Great Britain. You know, I believe, or I used to believe, that along the time, the system has been broken and has been manipulated to serve the rich and keep the poor poor, and when something goes wrong, it's the poor that pay for it with their lives, and they continue to operate as if nothing had happened. But up until recently, I've started to believe the system was never broken. The system was built this way. It was built this way on purpose to benefit them and protect them when they go wrong and when they kill people because of their greed. And that's what's happened. My uncle and 71 other people died because these people cared about their pockets more than the safety of their residents and the people that they had the duty of care of looking after. And that's quite hard to swallow. And that's why we do what we do. We have become obsessed with making sure that justice comes. And justice comes in many forms. Justice comes in accountability and people going to prison. That's what we would love to see. But justice also comes in the form of change. Change in how people are treated, regardless of the type of accommodation they live in. You know, change so that building regulations are there to serve a purpose to keep people safe, not there to serve a purpose to keep these companies in profit and making money, because that's what's happening today. And that's why we're here talking to you today. And we hope that you can sign up to our website. That's really the best way that you can help us. GrenfellUnited.org is our website. So I urge you, whether it's now on your laptops or on your phones, or when you leave this room, and go on your phones, just look up Grenfell United. You'll see our website, sign up, because that's where all of our campaigns are. We communicate with all of our people that sign up and let them know exactly what we're doing and what's coming up and how you can help. And if you're ever down in London, We do our silent walk on the 14th of every month, where we march around the community in total silence, in respect for the loved ones that we lost, and to also protest by disturbing their peace with peace. So if you're ever down, we'd welcome you with open arms, you know, show you how great and dignified our community has been for 2.5 years since the horrific fire, and it'll give you sort of, I guess, an insight into the great people that live in this community. We're not all people that are illegal immigrants that, you know, our names you can't pronounce, and we're all benefit scroungers or whatever. You know, you should meet some of the people that are in the Grenfell United committee. You know, some are business owners, some are investment bankers, some are scientists. You know, I have people who are on the committee that probably know building regulations inside and out, not because it was their hobby, no, because they're obsessed, because these building regulations killed their families. So we want to know everything and anything about what's happened in terms of government, these companies, before, during, and after, so that when we stand in front of these people, we are prepared to hit them with some serious truths and facts, and give them the reason, and give them an opportunity to try and make some changes. Because right now, sitting around a table with government ministers and all of these important people that promise us change has not got us very far. That's why our campaign strategy has changed to a more sort of guerrilla style campaign. I don't know if you guys have seen the projections that we did on buildings for the 2-year anniversary, which we then later projected onto Parliament, which was quite a lucky coincidence really, because when we did that, all the politicians were there having a meal outside Parliament dinner, and they all saw it. You know, and we wrote on Parliament 2 years after Grenfell, and this building still hasn't kept its promises. And we did the same on high-rise buildings, one in Newcastle, one in London, one in Manchester, saying that 2 years after Grenfell, this building still has dangerous cladding on it. This building has still not been fitted with sprinklers. This building still has fire doors that don't work. So these people are going to sleep every day with some serious anxiety issues. Like Lowkey is saying, they are going for a really, really tough time. And we're going around the country trying to meet as many as we can to try to galvanize and try to support each other and help each other in terms of what they can do to try to put pressure on their council, and how we can get them to support our campaign as a national campaign. Because we should really be calling for a national emergency right now. You know, this is really, really bad what's happening, and the actions from the government is just not good enough. I don't really have a lot more to say really, apart from that, guys. I do really appreciate being here. You know, we are being insulted by members of Parliament. The government is not only not acting quick enough to make these changes, but is also promoting the companies that were directly involved in turning that building into a death trap. A company that Stu knows very well and has spoken about and written a book about, which is Ryden. And the government has recently promoted them on this £30 billion framework list, basically saying that if anyone's looking for contractors to work on high-rise buildings in this country, Ryden are your people. And this is the same company that's being investigated by the police in the public inquiry. So the government's saying to us, we want to help you, but at the same time, business as usual for these organisations, who have also secured a £100 million deal in the Ealing Council to refurbish some of their buildings there. So while we're suffering and campaigning, you know, giving up time with our loved ones and not being able to rebuild our lives, they're promoting these companies, and they're still making ridiculous amounts of money as if nothing had happened. And that's why we need the support of this country more than ever, because it's clear that they're not listening to us anymore. But we ain't going anywhere. We're going to stay here for as long as it takes. And like Lowkey said, you know, this isn't about us anymore. We're never going to get our loved ones back. No matter how much I talk, no matter how much we campaign, no matter where we go, we are never going to get the 72 loved ones that we lost. But what we can do is make sure that nobody ever goes through what we went through. Nobody loses their families in the most horrific way possible and witnesses it in the way that we did. And that's really one of the main reasons, because we don't want our families to be remembered by this culture of neglect, because that's how they're being remembered right now. They're being remembered by losing their lives in the most horrific way and the culture of utter neglect. We want them to be remembered for, yes, of course, what happened, but for positive change that came after it. One of the main wins that we have had at Grenfell United is securing the future of the site. And that's one of the things that we did very, very early on. The last thing that we did, and the one thing that was causing a lot of anxiety for us, was the fact that after all of this was done, Grenfell Tower was going to be handed back to the council, and they were going to build or redevelop houses on it, or I don't know. And we wanted to make sure that they didn't touch Grenfell Tower or go anywhere near it. And we worked with the government, and we wrote terms of reference, and effectively it took 18 months to write up this document, and we had it signed by the government and the council and us, which now means that after the public inquiry is finished and after the criminal investigation is over, the tower and the surrounding land will belong to us, the bereaved, the survivors, and the local community. And that was massively important for us, because that's effectively the tombstone of where our loved ones lost their lives. And we're all in agreement that one day the tower will come down and some type of memorial garden will be built in its place, so that our kids and their kids can remember what happened here and the importance of, and the uncovering that Grenfell showed, how the government and the local authorities treat its people. And hopefully it will also show some positive change that came after it. And it will be a space that people can go and visit and pay their respects. I don't know what that will look like and how long that will take, but all we know is that it now belongs to us. And that was one of the most important wins for us as Grenfell United. There are other campaigns that we've done and we're doing as well, but I think that was probably the most important one to mention. And that's really it for me, guys. I'm sorry I'm not talking for that long. Lowkey, if I've missed anything, please let me know. And I'm happy to answer any questions if you guys want to speak to me now or after, and I'm sure Lowkey is as well. And I just really want to say again, thank you so much for having me here. Thank you so much for listening. We really do appreciate it. And please, please, please do sign up to our website and make sure that you support our campaigns and make sure Grenfell is never forgotten, I guess. Thank you.
Before we sort of end, I think it's a great opportunity for just like 10-15 minutes of open questions or thoughts or whatever, and then we'll have more of like a sort of like informal chats at the front. But if anyone's got a question, make a comment, so just go for it. Mary?
I was wondering whether the restaurant survivors have been rehoused.
Yeah, most of the survivors have been rehoused. A vast majority of them are in their permanent homes. There is still a small number that are still waiting to go into their permanent homes, but yes, they've all been rehoused. But that process took a long time. It didn't take 2 or 3 weeks like Theresa May had promised. It took a lot longer than that. But yeah, thank you for your question.
Just thank you for coming and sharing that. Obviously, it's extremely emotional, and I think Grenfell personally, for me, I always remember it because I went to school at Cardiff.
Okay, yeah.
So there was someone in the year above me and in the year below me who both fortunately survived the fire, but they were in hotel rooms for like 4 months, 4 or 5 months afterwards. And there were people at my school that had to have, because you could see the fire, you could see the building from the school. So people had to have like post-traumatic stress counselling. I was just wondering like how the process of where like what if you have like know very much about what the survivors are doing now and how they are able to participate or otherwise with the Grenfell United scheme, or some people have had to like step away. It's been too emotionally challenging.
Yeah, that's a good question. The vast majority of survivors and bereaved engage with Grenfell United, and we represent them. And there have been a small handful of people that have chosen to disengage because they've just wanted to get their new homes or bury their loved ones and just almost not have anything to do with it because it was just too much for them, which is understandable. But the vast majority of the survivors and bereaved do engage, not only with Grenfell United, but just with Grenfell in general, because, you know, it's part of their life now. You know, it's changed everybody's life for good, and people want answers and people want accountability. So the vast majority do engage, but there have been a small number of people that have decided to sort of keep their distance. But that may change. You know, people go through trauma and stages of griefs in different ways. So I guess maybe when some people are ready, they will then want to be part of, you know, what's going on and what's happening, but others may not want to, and that's understandable, I guess. Thank you for your question, Mel. Anybody else?
There's something I've come across. I was a private landlord, so I've got some experience of property ownership. And it's called Banker's Power of Attorney. In the loan agreements that I signed, there was a clause that was quite clear. It said that the borrower gives the lender power of attorney. And I would suggest that the people involved with the development of Grenfell, the ownership of Grenfell and the leasing of Grenfell, have similarly effectively handed over power of attorney to their banks. I mean, it applies to just about anybody who has an agreement with the bank. The banks have got power of attorney. So power of attorney is one word, control. And as our attorneys, they have some responsibilities as far as I'm concerned. If you read somebody like Kevin Aldridge's book on power of attorney, he points out that there should be some specifications about what authorities they have as our attorneys. And I just think I remember writing, for example, to my lenders some years ago and asking for a copy of the original agreements that I signed, and they never provided it. In fact, after a couple of days after posting my letter, asking them for a certified copy, the CEO of the company, the lender, was on the phone to me saying that, you know, he doesn't normally talk to lowlifes like me, customers. So I knew I was right, because what actually happens is they have this power of attorney so they can take our loan agreements and securitize them. They can create instruments out of them and enhance their profit margin and so on. But power of attorney is power of attorney at the end of the day. And I'd like to bet that everybody in this room has effectively handed over control to the banks. And so as our attorneys, as your attorneys, I think it's an avenue worth investigating, pursuing, really. Because I bet my bottom dollar that all the companies involved in the Grenfell, the construction of Grenfell and the management have a relationship with the bank which amount to power of attorney, donating power of attorney.
That's interesting. Thank you. I will definitely, I guess, look into that and find out a little bit more about it.
Of course, is money.
Yeah.
In the first place, and I define money now as a configuration of atoms on an LED. Or if you get a bank statement on a piece of paper, it's a configuration of ink molecules on a piece of paper. And Lord Adair Turner, who was the CEO of the Finance Services Authority, he described money really as these atoms were configured to show numbers really, and he describes these numbers as purchasing capacity. So there's no physical commodity actually changes hands, and of course it raises the question, what was the bank actually lending in the first place, and where does the money come from?
Yeah.
Paul Tucker, the former deputy governor of the Bank of England, he said that banks lend money by expanding both sides of their balance sheet simultaneously, which means that they're creating an asset and a liability simultaneously at the same time. The asset is the loan to the bank, the liability is a deposit. And Lord Adair Turner, again in his review of the global banking crisis, he explains it a bit better. He says that banks lend money by creating deposits in the name of the borrower. So if you have a loan, there's a deposit being created in your name. Unfortunately, of course, the banks don't call that side of the liability side, they don't call that money, but they call the side that enhances their profit, they call that money, which is unjust enrichment in mind.
It's interesting. Thank you. Appreciate that. I will definitely look into it with the rest of the team.
Yeah, well, I've been looking into this for a while. Unfortunately, I'm going to
Thank you.
Hi, thank you guys so much. You both talked really clearly about what you think mainstream media, journalists could and should be doing. I'd like to know what you think academics, researchers, students who are building up research skills could and should be doing to support you.
Sure, I'll just respond to this one really quickly.
Yes,
I think academics have a really important role to play in a lot of these situations. I think that when you look at the kind of logic which is currently forcing people into a situation where they have to take industrial action, where their work is becoming more and more precarious, where they are having to take on more work than ever before for often less money or the same money as before, a lot of that converges with the logic which underpins what happened at Grenfell. And, you know, no one, the first people that will know that will be the academics. But what I think would have been good, and I think is happening, and there are people that are coming forward, would have been for academics to approach people in the community and organizations and say, look, I have a background in studying this, I've done this, I've done that, how can I help? You know, and obviously it's understandable why those things might not have happened. People, I think, were hesitant to be seen as imposing a kind of vision on other people, which I think is completely valid. You know, also you're dealing with, historically, Notting Hill Carnival was the phoenix which rose out of this community. So Bramley Road, the road which is overlooked by Grenfell Tower, had 4 days of rioting where houses were being firebombed because it was believed at that time by teddy boys and people that were being encouraged by very well-known Oswald Mosley and those types of characters. They were being led to believe that, people from the Caribbean live in this community, so therefore firebomb them out, right? The response to that was political in and of itself. People realized that they had more in common with each other, people that live in the community, than with these people coming from outside telling them the way they should see the world. However, that doesn't mean that the community was particularly political before the fire. Yes, we were mobilized on a local level, but all of a sudden we were flung to the middle of a very complex, sophisticated machine with a lot of moving parts, okay? We're talking about the rollout of and Karim said it very well, the number one fear in the aftermath of Grenfell was the potential for social unrest off the back of it. Another fear was the potential of Grenfell being a vehicle for the election of Jeremy Corbyn, meaning that the extent to which the security state and military intelligence became concerned with us in the community is pretty exceptional. And it's going to come out over the years that are going to be ahead of us. But my point is to get to grips with something so complex and scary in many ways. We need as many people who have, you know, been thinking long, hard, and deeply about a lot of these issues and these things, and have the theory that kind of can be attached to practice and that can help us. So, you know, get involved with Grenfell United. We are setting about trying to set up free, you know, some type of, not quite free university, but something like that in the area whereby we can have weekly lectures from guest academics that can come in and help people in the community get to grips with some really important and substantial readings. And so that's what myself and Dan, who works closely with Grenfell United, are in the process of doing. So what I think was not helpful, though, and it's something that isn't limited to academia, but it did have some, it played some role in it, was the attaching of very, very baggy categorizations that pre-existed before Grenfell. So for instance, there are those that view what happened at Grenfell on a very deterministic line from British colonialism to now, right? And there was an element of that in some of the academic interaction with Grenfell. Now, Francis Wallace Grenfell, who the building was named after, was a British general involved in colonial wars in Sudan, colonial wars in Egypt. So there's an element of that which is interesting. But if you're going to link it to this idea of violence in the rest of the world and the British state, why not link it to the fact that Arconic also make the F-35? You know, that is the most important military contraption of the last few years that so many governments in the world have an interest in making a big deal. It was used by Israel in the bombing of Iraq recently. The big fear also is that this is going to be something that's going to be used against Palestinian population in Gaza and others. This is the type of solidarity that would be useful, not, for instance, comparing it to massacres that took place in the 1800s or the 1600s and then drawing a direct line of this is the sort of deterministic line of, oh, well, this is what happens to BME bodies. You know, this is how they're policed by. It's not true. There's far more interesting particularities about it than I think that particular analysis, which had some stock in some parts of academia, had. So I think it's mainly just trying to put that knowledge and that infrastructure at the disposal of the community would be fantastic.
I just wanted to know how you feel about these talks. And it was so inspirational. I only heard about it like yesterday through a friend, and like it was so good that I believe this lecture should be like with so many people. And I know so many people who would appreciate it to hear this talk and would do so much, have such a strong link with Grenfell. I don't know, I feel like so many people deserve to hear this talk.
Thank you so much.
You want to organise it again? So it's quite a quick put together this process. Like friends, what instruction said, Karim wants to talk, he's going to be here, he's going to be there, he's going to leave, and I'm like, yeah. But then it's about, can I get a lecture here? Yeah, one, this was it. Is the timing going to work for people in their studies? So timetables. So basically, then it's getting it out and thinking about time for people. So I made sure that a lot of people knew about it, but loads of people signed up and haven't come. So 170 people signed up, but 170 people haven't come. So we can definitely do it again. And I think what come out of it for me today is that there's a massive body of work that needs to be done. And it's not just about the analysis and the trauma and all the shit that's gone on. It's also about, okay, there's now 2 to 3 years plus of an inquiry, which is actually going to get into all the things that we've just been talking about. There are people in this room who've got skills, got time, a bit of time, and have got projects, dissertations, all kinds of things to do. And have got life after that. We could all be mobilised to be digging into the connection between the companies, the governments, the buildings, the bodies, the regulations, all of that. And this is something that when 1 or 2 people start digging, they suddenly become massively overwhelmed because you start to see this incredible complexity of corporate connections going back a long time, and you start thinking, I can't deal with this, I can't deal with that, I'm going to stop. So these two have already found out massive amounts about Arconic, Celotex and others, but just think about all the companies that connected to those companies and all the implications for other people around the world. That's like endless work that can be done, and everyone in this room can contribute to that exercise. So the next time that they come up, it's not going to just be, 2 hours of, this is shit. It's going to be 2 hours of, let's work. Wow, let's get in a different kind of room. Let's start thinking about all the companies. Let's get our laptops out and let's start working together. I'd be up for organising something like that.
That'd be amazing.
For instance, one of the things that me and Karim did, we had a show in Sheffield, and Karim found out that was actually where Arconic's headquarters were in London, in England. And so what we did is we organised with the cab drivers union local to Sheffield, the moving of the audience from the event, which was a few hundred people, to Arconic's office, which is only open supposedly from something like 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. in the morning. So it just happened to be the time when it was going to be open. So we organised an impromptu demonstration outside of Arconic's office. And so the point is that there's all types of different ways that we can apply pressure and enforce visibility on a lot of the powers at work in what happened at Grenfell, and also again generalize it, rather than there being a kind of monopolization of the right to speak about Grenfell. It should have been from the beginning. It should have been from the beginning something that everybody was talking about and saying, well, we live in a Grenfell building. Oh, we're in a Grenfell building. Those halls over there in Bolton should have been identified as a Grenfell halls. That needs to happen. That kind of conversation needs to happen. We need to, because we come from a place where mass death has happened. It didn't happen because an army came and killed 72 people. It happened because companies felt that they could boast about the penetration of regulatory bodies. Corporate captains of industry penetrated regulatory bodies and did everything that they could to cut costs. And that resulted in mass death. And so the important thing is to be able to generalize that example and realize how it could apply in loads of other places. So hopefully at some point we can organize coordinated protests and stuff like that.
Definitely.
Intervention then. Yes.
Yeah, I was wondering for Karim, thanks for talking as well. With you becoming blacklisted from the company and the industry, is that something that happened only specifically to you, or did that happen to other people?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I got asked that as well a few days ago. So the short answer is no, because since Grenfell had happened, no one has lost their job.
Do you know what a toilet
or
is?
people who have stopped working
Just
in
on the
the
right, yeah?
industries that they were was out of choice. So I was the only one that was sort of made redundant. And I was the only one that sort of experienced this. And I don't even talk to this about some of the people that I work quite closely with, because even saying it out loud sometimes makes me feel it's just, this still can't be true, like people being blacklisted, just because they're speaking out. Like, does this really happen? Is that what these companies, the lengths that they go to, they stop you from feeding your family just to stop you saying their name? But the facts point to that as a conclusion. But there's one other guy that's on our committee that has just finished his degree. He's a scientist, and he's been looking for work, and he's been having trouble finding work. And he's quite explicitly put on his role with Grenfell United on his CV. And I think that's been stopping him. It's been months now since he's been able to find a job, and I think that that's contributed to it. I don't know, think about it. If you are like a big company and your main ethos is, making customers happy, but making ridiculous amounts of money, when you're in a multi-billion pound or billion-dollar industry like the automobile industry, and you have somebody who you've put in charge of not only looking after a number of people, but running one of your flagship showrooms in one of the biggest cities or one of the most known cities in the world, do you really want him going on TV calling out the government and, and saying stuff like that? Like, I asked myself that question. I'd be like, no, I wouldn't hire that guy. I mean, I would hire me, obviously, because I'm amazing, but, you know, but it's true, like, it's just a risk that you don't want. And then I also remember I would have to say to my work, whenever something would happen, I'd have to go and do some media. And they'd always say to me, just make sure you don't say anything about work. And they'd ask me, what did they ask you about? What did you say? Did you say anything about work? And I said, I've never said anything. I've never spoken about my work up until recently. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. Sorry for rambling on a bit.